Hello, everybody. My name is Mathilde, and I am working with Erin Innovation. That's an Irish-based company on communication that works with European funded projects. And today I will be your host for the meeting. So very welcome. I'm very happy for you all to be there. The meeting is, we're gathering here today because of the MOD Alliance. So MOD for the three projects that are sister projects working for on the same goal. So MARCO-BOLO, OpenNX, and Diversity. Today, it's MARCO-BOLO's time to host. So I'm working with MARCO-BOLO into communication, and the two speakers that I want to introduce today are also working with MARCO-BOLO. So the three projects are funded by the European Commission and all working with the same objective, that is observing, mapping biodiversity and ecosystem with a particular focus on coastal and marine ecosystem, without forgetting freshwater, of course. So we did an alliance to unite our effort and amplify the impact of each project, and want to share progress, collaboration, and advocate for the preservation of coastal and marine and freshwater environment. We do webinar series and hope to do also some joint assets for the rest of our exploitations and communications. I will show you a very quick video of the webinar alliance before we wait for everybody to arrive, because there's still people joining. And then I will introduce the speakers, and then we can start the webinar. So I'll share my screen now and show you the short video. Right, if you can see it all. So today, so today we have the two speakers from MARCO-BOLO working with the project on the standardization of data. So we have Pier Luigi Buttigieg, that is working in Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany and specializes in bringing science and technology to make ecological data more interoperable and actionable, and deeply involved in international efforts like the UN Decade Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, among others, and work in developing tools like scientific data with global sustainability goal. And we have Dan Lear is working at the Marine Biological Association in the UK, and is the lead of IT and data teams at the Marine Data Association. The key figure in global initiative and like Ocean Biodiversity Information System, like the OBIS system, and his work focused on making biodiversity data accessible, standardized, and usable for sustainable ocean management. Today, they'll talk about the importance of metadata standardization, how we make the data more open, transparent, and interoperable. So I'll let them talk in more detail about it better than I will do. And if you have questions, don't feel or don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and then you can raise your hand as well, and then we'll go over. If you don't want to put your camera, you don't have to. And if you want me to speak your questions, you can just say it in the chat. So enjoy.
Okay, thanks, Mathilde, for the introduction. And it's fantastic to see so many people here today. I appreciate it's the end of the day for a lot of European partners here and colleagues. So thank you for joining us. It's great to see some familiar faces as well as some new ones. So we're actually reaching beyond our usual community and expanding the message. So that's fantastic. So this is a double header presentation from Pier Luigi and myself, and we're going to be swapping in and out, but we're covering the work that MARCO-BOLO is doing in this space to do with data standardization and data flow, but also how that connects and intersects to the global landscape. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction. I know Mathilde did the MOD Alliance piece, but just about MARCO-BOLO. We're kind of midway through the project at the moment. We complete in November 2026. It's a 48-month project. And we've got a really wide participation across 14 countries, 28 participants, and our overall budget is 7.3 million euros. So we've got a reasonable amount of resource to work with. Obviously, that's not all about standardizing biodiversity data, which would be fantastic if we did, but we are looking at how we can apply those standards and those infrastructures and applying infrastructural work to new data themes that are coming out and being developed through those technical work packages of the rest of the MARCO-BOLO project. Next slide. So just again, briefly on the project objectives, it's about this framework to align with global standards to make sure that biodiversity data, coastal, marine and freshwater within the context of MARCO-BOLO can get to where it needs to be. So we are looking at novel technologies, but the bit that we're focusing on today really is about how producers of biodiversity data and the end users can align their requirements and how we can ensure that the data gets to where it needs to be and is actionable and usable by the widest members, widest communities who need it for the purposes they need, both for local, regional and global applications. Next slide. To paraphrase the Apollo 13 mission, Brussels, we've had a problem. There are significant issues with the availability of data globally. We're seeing a doubling of data every 40 months since the 80s. This explosion of data is presenting real challenges. You couple that with the fact that we are seeing every 20 years, 80% of scientific data being lost that's publicly funded and should be publicly accessible. And that obviously has an implication for the European economy. We see a cost related to the lack of findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable data in excess of 10 billion euros every year. And purely selfishly, data professionals like myself are spending up to 50% of our time looking for data, re-engineering data, standardizing it, and potentially duplicating work because that data isn't as accessible and as open as it should be within this sector. And that, I think a lot of people think we've solved this problem. Since the Horizons 2020 funding program, we've had that data management strategy that was to make data as open as possible, as closed as necessary. You can't throw a rock without hitting a fair data infrastructure. You know, everyone is claiming fairness of their systems and making new portals or developing new applications that meet at least by nodding to the FAIR principles. But the FAIR principles don't necessarily equate to open data, and fair for one person doesn't equate to fair for another group or another community. We see projects producing data management plans that are merely tick boxes, and those data management plans don't have a legacy through the project and aren't used as a test of a success of a project. So we see data management plans, say, produced in the first few months and are never looked at again. They just sit gathering dust on virtual shelves. And those data management plans aren't looked at with a clear eye of scrutiny by the people in the funding agencies or the grant awarding bodies. Next slide. And so what we end up with is this scenario. We end up with a fair data system, a fair silo, but we have barriers between them. Those systems might be fantastic for that individual community or for an individual institute, but as soon as you try and connect those systems and get interoperability across organizations or across domains or even across projects, that very quickly unravels and becomes an increasingly challenging, expensive and time-consuming task.
Right. So, from that perspective, what do we do about it? Before the UN Ocean Decade started, there was a working group, an intersessional working group convened by IOC and IODE of UNESCO to talk about the data stewardship culture around the world and what needs to change. And so, how do we fix the situation where we have these fair silos. People are investing large amounts of funds and resources in developing their systems, and they're not going to let them go. They're not going to redevelop it simply because another region or an international community comes in and says, this is the new cool thing. Throw away everything you got and do this now. That's not going to happen. So we have to think about a way where you can nest those systems together and allow them to talk to each other across their barriers while still keeping those barriers. Indeed, we see the importance of those barriers more and more from everything from private sector data with intellectual property rights. In science, scientists often hoard their data until they publish a publication. That's their crediting. That's, again, a cultural issue that is causing issues around the digital ecosystem, but also things like indigenous data, for example. We need to be very careful about how it is used and by whom. So the conclusion of that working group, there's a report that was written by it. I was a member of that group too. The conclusion was more or less to say, okay, great, make sure your silo is a nice silo. Get your house in order. Make sure you're doing what you need to do for your individual users, interest groups, stakeholders, what have you. But make sure that people don't even have to know about your digital architecture in order to use your data. Make sure that you can push your data and your metadata onwards to other systems so they can ingest it and then that they can understand it, convert it to the kinds of formats and serializations they need for their compute infrastructure, and apply it to their own problems. Again, without necessarily having to collaborate with you, without having to write another grant and use more resources for fairly menial tasks in terms of just changing data formats. We should now move beyond trying to hire people just to do that. We still have to, unfortunately, but the future does not look like that. So that's one of the objectives there. And in a sense, that's the question that we pose to ourselves. You know, fair is context dependent. What is the digital ecosystem that you are in or that we are in as MARCO-BOLO? Who are our consumers? Who are the producers of data that we want to pull data in from? And who do we want to talk to? Which language do we choose to speak in order to get stuff done within a certain ecosystem? So that was the question we asked ourselves in work package 1 of MARCO-BOLO. Does our data go to where it's supposed to go? Is it ingested by the systems that we say in our proposal, in our grant outline, we want to deliver to? And so we outlined the essential variables, so the essential ocean variables and the essential biodiversity variables as those interlocutors, the digital interlocutors that we want to interface with. We found a way for the EOVs, we're working on a way for the EBVs, but then that helps sort of rationalize the problem and say, what do we actually need to build to make sure the data gets where it needs to go? So the digital ecosystem we're working in is this federation that's coordinated now primarily by UNESCO, again, within the framework of the UN Ocean Decade. It won't always be that way. And you know, we're taking to heart that whatever is being built here will last beyond that. And also, since a lot of the architecture here is web architecture, there's nothing very special about it in terms of UNESCO hasn't developed new standards so that everyone has to use. If these things just go away, if the organizational units here disappear, the system still works as long as we have an internet and a web built on top of that with technologies. So this is the ecosystem that we're talking about. We primarily look at the ocean data and information system as our the primary glue that's gluing together all of these different subsystems and silos. Systems like GOOSE, the Global Ocean Observing System, which is the organization that is coordinating the essential ocean variable process. So we know we have to talk to them. And we also know that they are building portals for those EOVs, for the biology and ecosystems EOVs, for example. A bioeco portal is being put together primarily led by OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, but others, and also supported by EU projects like BioEco Ocean. So we know that our MARCO-BOLO data, whatever we're generating, we want it to flow through this ecosystem, be understood by that ecosystem, and flow into those portals. That is the success metric. It's not about how many publications we have or if we have stuff on Zenodo. That's nice, but as Dan said initially, that will disappear. It'll disappear if it's not in a long-term archive and if it's not ingested and understood by the downstream systems at the end of that value chain that need to use it for whatever purposes that we aspire to assist with our research and our innovation. So that's our context over there. It fits neatly within the UN Ocean Decade. Again, the strategy document of the UN Ocean Decade has a number of top-level objectives here for data and information. It is about that digital ecosystem. the ecosystem that we're targeting overlaps very much with the broader digital ecosystem of the ocean, which still has groups and systems that are not interfaced with Otis, but we're working on that. It certainly addresses most of the others. And most importantly, Objective 4, prioritizing digital solutions that support decisions for sustainable ocean management. Again, it's nice. Of course, it has value always to publish scientific studies, to release scientific data. But unless that data is actually ingested by a system that is being used by decision makers at various levels, it's sort of dead. It's sort of inert data. Hopefully somebody finds it, but why leave it to chance when you can engineer your way to be heard, right? So that's what we're doing with MARCO-BOLO. We're aligning our digital architecture, so our internal architecture, our internal organizing, so our internal processes and our internal strategy to adopted by our ecosystem partners. So this is the ESAO model that you will see coming out in the implementation plan of the decade's data and information strategy that we're trying to release by the end of this month. There have been delays. It was supposed to be out last year, but we're working furiously to release it. And in a sense, MARCO-BOLO has been fortunate because myself, Dan, and others are involved in those processes to set this implementation framework for the UN Ocean Decade. And therefore, we can have a little bit of a preview from MARCO-BOLO and create a pathway for other European projects or other temporary projects, let's say 4 years, 3-year projects, to have a route to engage with that ecosystem strategy and ecosystem architecture. So that's the plan, and that's what we're pursuing.
So yeah, to pick up from that aim and the plan is how are we doing it and what have we been doing? Say we're halfway through the MARCO-BOLO project now, so this is a status check of where we are. And like Pier Luigi said, within the MARCO-BOLO project, we were really fortunate that we've got this collection of expertise around data management and data standards, and people who are embedded in those communities, and we really enshrined data running across the entire project. It wasn't just a bolt-on work package. It was something that was key across all the elements. And it's about, again, not just using the data management plan and the data processes as a tick box. It's making sure that they have that longevity and a lasting pathways are being built. But we're not doing this in isolation. As you saw from some of the illustrations in the previous slides, we're about connecting to this interoperable framework that's a global approach to managing data. So we're working with key partners and connecting to key frameworks, the essential ocean variables, the essential biodiversity variables, but also ensuring where we can that we're speaking within Europe to the requirements under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and Water Framework Directives and the indicators that form part of that. But what we should be providing is data in a way that is agnostic to end use, as long as it is available and accessible in the long term through these aggregators and long-term repositories. We can make sure that it is findable by the end users and by those frameworks. But again, we're not doing this in isolation. Although we've got the expertise within the partnership, we recognize that we're part of a much wider and connected community. So we're speaking with the key partnerships, the key frameworks, with the Goose community, the Geobond community, the regional sea conventions across Europe, but also European Environment Agency, key policymakers and influencers and thinkers within the European space, with the overall aim of creating this stable, sustainable biodiversity data flow and this exchange system to make sure that that knowledge is getting where it needs to be. Next slide. All of this is enshrined in our initial data management plan. It's been very widely circulated and incredibly well received. There's a sort of glowing endorsement from the US Geological Survey there. We've published it on Zenodo with a DOI to ensure it's fully citable. And it's already been adopted and adapted as a living document by a number of Horizons Europe projects. It's been illustrated as an exemplar data management plan at a Goose G7 workshop around global marine plankton observing, and was also part of the recent JRC Future of Marine Biodiversity Monitoring in Europe workshop series and contributed to that as well. So again, this isn't just a tick box data management plan. It's a document that we use as a touchstone at every stage through the project and will have a life beyond it. So it's going to evolve through the project, and it's going to have implementation stages as well that will also be published and made widely available for the community to take and adapt. And again, it isn't the MARCO-BOLO way of doing things. This is looking at those global systems and how they can be integrated into projects of this type. And one of the biggest, one of the initial challenges we found was about this this mismatch in digital literacy between the sort of the biodiversity research community on one hand and the data management community. And both of those, as I say, have been brought together within the MARCO-BOLO project. But we were very much about how do we bridge that gap? We're not sitting on one side of our fence, demanding people learn new ways of working or have to re-engineer or redistribute their data several different times. What we want to do is build that capacity, inform, educate, but also meet people halfway to build that capacity and to sort of nudge the digital literacy in the direction of these standards, these technologies, these tools that will help the data be accessible and available beyond the lifespan of projects. And whilst that takes a bit more effort, it'd be fantastic if we could just assume that the research community would adopt our ways of working. That wasn't going to be the case, and we really wouldn't be able to progress the project and build that capacity without that intermediate step. This was really highlighted in an early output from MARCO-BOLO that looked at more than 850 stakeholders that we're working with about how people are engaging with data repositories, and sort of the slightly terrifying statistics from my perspective, that there's a large number of our stakeholders working in marine biodiversity data research and data collection, data generation, that aren't interacting with some of these large repositories, these long-term repositories. And that really speaks back to that statistic that I put up near the start about how we're seeing a loss of data, because if it isn't in these long-term repositories, then there is real risks of data being lost or data being orphaned from where it needs to be.
Right, and that's something that as a scientific community, we can't possibly be satisfied with. One's papers, one's knowledge products will be relevant for 5, if you're lucky, 10 years, if you're very lucky, maybe longer. But most of that will be obsolete very, very quickly. But the data that you generated during your scientific expeditions, that's gold. I mean, we're still using data from the 1700s, even earlier, that it was well organized and preserved. It's still vital for us to be able to talk about the changing climate or anything else, from culture to biodiversity. How well you've archived and organized and described your data determines its future. So that's, again, something we're doing in MARCO-BOLO. We're going back to the basics. It's often the case in many projects, especially research and innovation projects, that one would publish a brand new way of handling data, a new standard for biodiversity data. We're not doing that. We're reusing the standards that are already well-crafted from the biodiversity community, like the TADWIG group or the Genomic Standards Consortium for biological and biodiversity information. And we're going back to the original architecture of the web and the notion of this 5-star linked open data model that Tim Berners-Lee and others who conceived of the web said, look, that's what we should be aspiring towards. We sort of forgot about this course of development over the years as people developed very cool applications and architectures and point-and-click interfaces. It felt like we didn't really need it anymore because there'll always be an application or software that can do the job for you. But then we end up in this situation where if you don't use the same software I'm using, we can't work together. That's because we too tightly coupled technology and applications to data architecture, which should be underneath them. It's like, again, the analogy we often use, the plumbing versus the fountain that Terry McConnell said at our G7 digital twin meeting. If you get the plumbing right, you can build many fountains on top of that look completely different and do other things. You can also build other things, not just fountains. But the plumbing is the important bit, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to help our scientific teams in MARCO-BOLO move from the sort of Excel spreadsheety way of doing things towards this linked open data way. Now, of course, in a 4-year project, we can't retrain everyone to understand linked open data or to be excited about it or to even care about it. But what we can do is to create some lightweight interfaces for them to be able to use things that they're more comfortable with, tabular formats, etc., maybe with a little bit better data modeling behind it, and then write some very lightweight software to convert that into this linked open data that can be pushed on to Otis, Ocean Info Hub, the digital ecosystem in the decade, and the EOV portals. That we know. The other stakeholders that Dan mentioned, in terms of European Environment Agency, MFSD, we could send data to them, but often their ingestion targets are not really well defined, at least as far as we've discovered. Work Package 6 in MARCO-BOLO is working on trying to develop those relationships and find out what do we hand over to them and how. But if the answer is please email us an Excel sheet, it's not really going to fly for us. We could, but we're going to prioritize things that are, let's say, more performant. So this is an important step where we are creating some really lightweight applications to get those tables into linked open data. But those applications are not the point. At the end of MARCO-BOLO, if they're never used again, we don't mind, because their point is to get the data flowing into the system, archived and available long-term. This is an important step because many projects are going to do new things. That's our job, right? We research, we innovate, we do new things. So we can't always rely on the submission system of an existing infrastructure to be able to capture what we want to say as scientists, what we want to say as innovators, right? We could, of course, ask them to add something, but they may not have time, resources, it may require another grant. So we need something nimble such that even like a plucky little project who just has a new idea can create something that will be ingested by that system, and then what is said, it's archived, and it's there for hundreds of years longer. So that's the objective. So we're helping our researchers work with different kinds of workflows, with our bioinformatics, with genomics, with macroorganisms, others, any sort of biodiversity, including the metadata that doesn't always stay in biodiversity. A lot of the metadata is relevant to marine physics, marine chemistry, etc. And if we break that apart properly as we move towards the right of this diagram into linked data, then those systems that are not biodiversity systems, but may be interested in some of the metadata, or from our perspective, metadata that we gather, metadata to us is data to them. So they'll be able to detect it and pull it into their systems once it's flowing through some sort of knowledge graph technology like Otis. Of course, as I said before, Otis is not, and our target system on the marine side and the UN Ocean Decade side is not, it's not its own set of standards. Whatever is read by Otis can also be read by search and discovery interfaces run by Google, by Microsoft, Yandex, Yahoo, others. They all use similar web architectures, and that's again what we try to do. So again, that flow into Otis, we know that it's going to get into the Goose and the IOC data architecture that we just talked about at the Goose Steering Committee about an hour ago. We know that. We're still working on trying to figure out how to make sure this gets into GeoBon and into the essential biodiversity variable process. There's a disconnect there, but this is important that work like this highlights this disconnect. We can all sort of fly the fair flag and talk about the great future of biodiversity data, but we're really checking that it works. It's a sort of trust but verify scenario.
Yeah, so we're just going to walk through now what that looks like as far as an entry on that Otis architecture, or through the kind of view onto Otis that you get through the Ocean Info Hub. So every organization, and MARCO-BOLO in this example, can have an entry on the Otis catalog that gives you some summary information. So you can create a registration as an organization, and any organization is, or partnership or grouping is able to do that. It's very well documented, and it's technically relatively straightforward to do so. And within this context, you have something called a sitemap, which will list all the assets that are, in this case, available and produced by MARCO-BOLO, and the JSON LD documents for those elements. And this isn't just data sets we're talking about. Obviously, this can cover any of the knowledge assets coming out from the project. So papers, media, presentations, videos, but also scripts, workflows, algorithms, etc., and also going as far as describing the people in the organizations, and because it's linked data, the connections between all those as well. And And then on the linking through that, you can check the ODIS dashboard exists and allows you to validate and check that the data is there, that it is being indexed, that it is accessible. And so you can see, it's quite small text, but the MARCO-BOLO information is being indexed and is accessible, and now forms part of that wider ODIS knowledge graph. It's just one of those interconnections within this wider system. And because all these nodes are using these common standardized web technologies, it allows them to be discoverable. They are validated and cataloged in a standardized way.
Mm-hmm. Just a short interjection there too. So this is actually, this is not a figure, a drawn figure. This is actually the topology of the ODIS meta graph from all of its different partners around the world. MARCO-BOLO is somewhere in there. Can't see it obviously, but it's just to drive home that this is not aspirational. This is functional technology, and in a very real sense, this is the ocean community organized through IOC UNESCO, taking a little bit of control back from, let's say, the big 5 tech companies, which we have somehow accepted run our internet, right? But they don't. The internet was never conceived that way. And so in a sense, it's taking a little bit back and resculpting the ocean part of the internet to be a little bit more democratized in terms of usage.
And yeah, as Pier would say, anyone can go on and validate and see that the data from MARCO-BOLO is flowing, or the assets from MARCO-BOLO are flowing. They're available through the ODIS infrastructure. Our sitemap is valid. There's a number of resources that have been mapped through that technology, and also the data it was first indexed. So you get that transparency through this system as well, and also links through, you can see through to the MARCO-BOLO GitHub repository. So we have that full availability of information to open to anyone.
Mm-hmm. And that checkmark, that validation checkmark, is extremely important. Again, it's fair in practice, not just in principle. Right, and just another thing, I'll go through this quite quickly. Again, with the essential ocean variables, we were quite lucky to work with Goose directly, because again, when that portal, that BioEco portal eventually is going to have to detect that MARCO-BOLO or other projects have pushed EOV data that is interesting to them. So again, we're not coming up with our own European EOVs, etc. We're linking to that Goose process and the various panels that they put together to identify the EOVs. There are specification sheets linked to each one of those. And we helped Goose actually create semantics that label each one of those EOVs. This is done in ENVO, the environment ontology, which I co-edit. I'm the lead editor there. But again, that work wasn't done for quite a while because I didn't know, as the maintainer of this ontology, whether it was worth it. Because if Goose doesn't endorse those sort of semantic markup as official in some regard, so that its systems will actually detect it, then I'm doing interesting work, but kind of more just, innovation work that may or may not be interesting. Might get a paper out of it, but it's not going to change the world. But once we got agreement from Goose that, okay, we're going to use these as the official markup semantics for the EOVs, we can start developing them and putting a lot more time and effort. I could justify using my MARCO-BOLO time for that and let a European project help the global system create the architectures that everyone else can use too. So that is also then going to be recorded. It's not there yet, but we'll update the ODIS documentation about how any project can mark up their data sets or their digital assets, whatever they happen to be, as EOV relevant to be detected by ODIS, IODE, Goose, and all other relevant IOC systems. This is just a screenshot from Peter Provost, right? So they're prototyping a few things to develop the BioEco EOV portal. Again, BioEco Ocean is supporting that with other projects too. Opus is leading that work. This is just the idea that eventually MARCO-BOLO's data and anyone else's data can be accumulated by that portal. We will then get deeper from the metadata towards the actual specifications on what kind of data you should push. Anticipation will be something like Darwin Core Archives, because again, managed by TADWIG and the Biodiversity Information Standards community. And then you can start building these dynamic layers, which also then refers to the vision of the UN Ocean Decade, these interoperable layers of data that can be assembled dynamically and then delivered to applications run by anybody, anywhere. Right, so we're doing this. So that thing that I showed you at the beginning, it's not aspirational, it's not just an idea. It was an idea 4 years ago. But now it's reality, and we're getting closer and closer to then show this minimal viable product. And we're very happy that MARCO-BOLO can be a project level, not organizational or institutional level, but a project level, something that will come and go. But we know that the digital legacy of this project will be preserved via long-term archiving of our assets, and then the linking of the metadata catalog describing those assets to Otis such that they can be pulled into downstream applications. We hope then that becomes a model that can be used by other transient organizations or projects as time goes by.
And yeah, like Pier said, this is operational. This is happening now. We can demonstrate that through the Ocean Info Hub dashboards that we show. But there is still work to do within MARCO-BOLO. We've still got 2 years of the project, and we've still got aspirations that we want to achieve. So as we've mentioned all the way through, we're about engaging with the key stakeholders, key communities. So with these long-term repositories, with Otis itself, the international groups like GBIF, INSDC, but also within Europe, the regional sea conventions, and supporting the needs of digital twins, both to validate the flows to make sure the data is accessible and usable for them. And the way we're delivering that is through, within MARCO-BOLO, a community of practice, but also through our engagement in events like this and involvement with those communities like the Goose Steering Committee and the BioEco panel that we're all, several of us are involved with. One of the key areas that's come out of those discussions is about the provision of provenance information. So this concept of, what has happened to those data, those assets on its journey from creation through to its sitting in one of these long-term repositories. And that's essential to build sort of trust and transparency, particularly when these data sets or these outputs are going to be used for the development of policy. People quite often don't want raw data. They want interpreted, derived products, maps, infographics, etc., to help inform policy development. But we need to be able to show that full data lifecycle and what has happened. And the linked open data approach and the Ocean Info Hub Otis approach helps us capture that in a standardized way as well. And again, as I say, the data management plan, this isn't a one and done situation. This is a legacy and a resource that we're going to continue to add to and evolve, but also to make it accessible to the widest community, to make sure that it isn't just a large monolithic document, that we have touch points and intuitive access to people, to make sure we're doing that communication and bridging that digital literacy gap. Next slide. So the goal, this is just in summarizing the last few slides that we've presented. It's really about developing a standardized, sustainable data flow. We've got this data flow, these data and knowledge assets that are endorsed and validated and connected within global data infrastructures. But we also want to see this building of capacity within the community, increasing awareness of how the linked open data approach and infrastructures such as Otis can help improve the value and the utility of biodiversity data. And we're not doing this alone. We're developing this, co-developing this with the whole community. So that's all for this presentation. And I think we open the floor to questions.
Dan, I don't know if you want to explain this like psychedelic silo thing. Like silos talking to each other, or did you give this to AI? Is this? This
is AI's interpretation of an interconnected, standardized data flow, going from the silos, the fair data silos that we presented before, to this multicolored, multifaceted, interconnected data world that we want to live in.
Man, this thing's going to kill us all for sure.
Well,
okay, yeah, but questions, yeah, before. Yeah,
that's a good transition, because we have Tancred. Barrow, I don't know if Tancred wants to, do you want to ask the question yourself, but it's about AI.
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Tancred, and thank you again for doing this webinar. I find it especially interesting because this topic is often not mentioned in most of the literature I've been able to read. So the question related to the artificial intelligence is that usually, as you have suggested or talked about in the beginning of this webinar, is that the scientific community has a lot of potential to create and produce a lot of data. But the processing and the storage of this scientific data cause some problems. So of course, technicalities and other digital problems related to the format of the data we produce could be easily solved by the artificial intelligence, as the processing speed is much more faster than human beings. But I wanted to ask you, what was the place of the artificial intelligence when you have more and more data available over time? Do you think of coupling the artificial intelligence with human operator, or is it essentially a system that will be entirely operated by artificial intelligence?
Mhm. I think again, when we say artificial intelligence, we usually, or I assume you mean machine learning primarily, right?
Yes.
No, okay, right. So machine learning is not magic, right? It requires a good training set. It requires a known limit of application, etc. Many of the recent advances in LLMs, they look impressive because, of course, they're dealing with things that people talk about a lot in more or less the same way. Science often is not like that. Science is often a few people talking about something very specialized and usually disagreeing with each other, right? So we have to be a little bit careful about how we use it. But our policy is very optimistic in the sense, if we, and then by aligning with global architectures and supporting others and also describing their data well, doing it in a machine accessible way, in a very granular way, if we start changing that behavior in the scientific community, we can start training our AIs to be a little bit less hallucinogenic when they encounter scientific data. So I think the work we're doing here is laying the foundation to improve machine learning, to improve the accuracy of that sort of AI assistance that we can expect. Of course, at the end of the day, this is going back to Dan's point on provenance. Somebody has to be on the hook, especially if a scientific data product is going to be used for decision making, for policy, for delineating a marine protected area, or establishing a new regulation. Somebody has to take responsibility for that. Somebody has to be sued if something goes wrong at the end of the day. Until we can sue the AI agent, I think we're still going to have a lot of human intervention in this system. But that doesn't mean that we can't prepare to feed the machine learning tools that can help us accelerate this work. We know that already you can dump in like a spreadsheet that's usually strangely formatted and say, hey, look, can you get me a JSON LD document out of this? And it gets 80% of the way there. It still needs validation, of course, so that you don't say something you didn't mean to. But the more we train that, the more predictable things get, the more the scientific community starts to adopt, let's say, more normalized practices in data management, the better that scenario is going to be. Dan?
No, just to give an example, I know there was a recent GBIF competition for standardization of data, and one of the winners of that was a machine learning model that took essentially raw data and transformed it into Darwin Core Archive. But again, it's that level of scrutiny and validation, and it might do, as Pier Luigi says, sort of 80% of the work, but we're not currently in a position where we can fully trust that and just let that data fly through these data pipelines. It still has that level of human scrutiny, and we're seeing it as there's areas more generally where we know it can help with things like streamlining image analysis pipelines, very simplified taxonomies using pattern recognition and computer vision models. But again, it doesn't replace that human element currently. And I'm not sure it's something we've addressed explicitly in the MARCO-BOLO data management plan for that reason.
Not explicitly, but again, like the more we clean up the internet for ocean science, the better the training set is going to be for even the LLM scale sort of approaches. So I would anticipate that it will help. And then that's probably the next grant to leverage it more effectively.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much for your very complete answers.
No, thank you for the question. I see we have some more.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Frank Miller. I don't know if Frank, you want to unmute, otherwise I will just read the question. Hi.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dan and Pier Luigi. Really appreciate the talk. I was wondering, many of us are trying to do similar things and trying to mobilize data into these databases from these different projects in different places around the world. And yet we're not very well coordinated on how do we, one, convince people to do that, second, make it easier for them we give workshops here and there. OBIS gives some workshops. We give some workshops through MBON. And what I wonder is if there's a way to all coordinate on the lesson plans, the data mobilization strategies, so that we can all train trainers and propagate this in a way that is more effective. But ultimately, it comes down to people spending time on transforming the data from the format they have or in the computer that they have on their own. And often it comes to the end of the project, they run out of money and the data goes by the wayside, as Dan explained earlier. So how do we make this easier? How do we train more people on common strategies to do this? And I know this webinar is an example of how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, how do we bring the actual how to do it into workshops that we all do around the world?
Right. Yeah. So I think that's part of the goal with our deliverables linked to this work package. Like we are updating this, we're trying to stabilize it. And actually, MARCO-BOLO is a nice sort of incubator for this, because we have to continually negotiate with our scientific teams about where they're going to meet us. You know, what is the middle for a biodiversity scientist to say, okay, I can go this far with the current resources and the current training and capacity that exists, and then we need something to pick it up and push it on to the data chains. So we do need more training materials. I think MARCO-BOLO is going to output a good core of that, but then it needs to be wrapped into something like a syllabus or something that can be a little bit more transmitted and socialized. With you, Frank, we're working, I think Isabel, you're also here. So working on that syllabus with the UN University, right, to come up with a biodiversity information management syllabus for the 21st century. I think that's a great opportunity to do it, to actually take this into education quickly, because, you know, we can't wait until all the systems are built and then say we're going to train people. We need we need the master students and PhD students and early level postdocs now to start learning this reality, right? Even if they don't become data stewards themselves, they have to know this exists, so that they get excited when their data is submitted to, let's say, OBIS, which relays that to OTIS, and then they see it across data systems around the world, right? Without ones they've never even heard of before, they're having an impact and changing people's lives. More people than will ever read a paper that's generated by their data. So I think we need to take those, we need to take some of those stories as they develop and highlight them and communicate how impactful information can be. We all know that from social media impacting our democracies. We know how powerful information technology can be. We have to bridge that messaging to the scientific community to say, look, the same rules apply here too, if we do it correctly and we tune into the right systems that are listening for the right signals. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, Frank. I think we have to first, before we start like educating people on the things that will work in a piecemeal fashion, projects like MARCO-BOLO will show the sort of end-to-end story and say, look, we know this works. It's worth training people up in this. And it's not just like a Python course or an R course that will teach you skills, but doesn't teach you the point, right? So if we combine the skills with the point of having those skills for both science and sustainable development, I think then we're onto something.
Yeah, and I think that, like I say, the real value is in those outputs, like we've shown with the data being available and visible through those maps that are a pilot output from the BioEco-Oceans project. When people can see tangible outputs, that's when you get that engagement and people suddenly start to pay attention and take notice. And I've heard anecdotally, you know, dozens of times people wish they'd known that systems existed, things like OBIS existed, and the tools around OBIS existed when they were at university, when they were doing postdocs and PhDs. So it's just about communicating that message in a consistent way, but having those outputs to demonstrate it.
Yeah, the curriculum that Pier Luigi mentioned that we're trying to develop with the World Maritime University. The World Maritime University is under the IMO, so it's kind of an effort to try to bring that to a formal curriculum that can be adopted by universities and then implemented even in informal education frameworks, like for professional development. Because I confess, when I went through grad school or undergrad, I was never exposed to this kind of data management either. So, yeah. And I think that most biologists or oceanographers are still not trained that way.
No, yeah, it's a thing. I started as a biochemist, right, and then a microbial ecologist, but I knew that for my PhD work, I needed to move data and I couldn't because the data was in such a poor state. You know, it was there, it was in INSDC, but there were no real standards at the time. So then I realized, look, if we want to upscale science, we need to fix that. We need to do it. It's just the same way as when the scientific community agreed to have certain publishing norms for its papers. We're going through the same thing now in the history of science. We're going through that same thing now. We just need to do it faster because you know, we have quite important things to inform decision makers on at the moment. So yeah, that pathway to training is key. I see Guillaume, you have some questions, and then Isabel has her hand up.
Yeah, shall I take the first? I can take the first one on. Do you want to unmute, Guillaume?
No. Just go, please. First to the questions. We can talk later. Yeah.
Guillaume,
Okay.
yeah.
So thank you for this presentation. I'm Guillaume Body from Biodiversity Plus and from the French Biodiversity Agency. And I have 3 questions. First, when you show your statistic about the connection with platforms, you focused on the international platforms, but there were a good connection with national platform. And in terms of governance, it may be a key element because countries are able to have mandatory requests and depository. So how does this level of governance at the national level fit in your landscape? I just go through the 3 questions.
Okay. No, let's pause after each one because it'll be too long. So
okay.
For MARCO-BOLO, we don't have to deal with that. That's more like an Otis question, you know, like how does a global federation of data systems cope with, let's say, regulations at a national level or so? MARCO-BOLO has to deal with a microcosm of that. For sure, some of our partners have reporting obligations to their nations, but usually that's satisfied. Like it's often satisfied by the partner. In the architecture that we present, in our data management structure, you can do that. There's nothing preventing you reporting to who you need to report to with whatever standards, etc., that you do. And then in your metadata, you describe that. You describe where your data flows so that not just you know, not just MARCO-BOLO knows, but that's transmitted to the whole UNESCO IOC system, that they become aware of these data flows going to regional bodies or to national offices that require reporting. There's nothing that in our data management that prescribes that. There's nothing that proscribes it either. It's entirely up to the people managing their data at a local level. So data sovereignty is secure. You can do what you need to do, and you can communicate that effectively.
I was just going to add that if we're talking at the national level, and I didn't explain this in the chart, but you know, we have national OBIS nodes and regional nodes and national and regional GBIF nodes. So OBIS is already connected into the ODIS IOC architecture. GBIF data can flow as well. So there's no, you know, we're not precluding a national level reporting that fits within that architecture already.
Exactly. And, you know, this is really important because we get this situation where for the past 3 or 4 EU Horizon calls, more or less every biodiversity project says we're going to have a dedicated flow of information to stakeholders, and they build a new one, and everyone's getting tired, and everything's getting very confusing. So again, with MARCO-BOLO, we're doing this a bit differently. We're saying, look, there are established networks. Let's leverage those networks as far as possible. We do have Work Package 6 that is going to find out where gaps exist and maybe advise it. But, you know, we can't keep affording to just do things all over again and brand it with the project name. And we don't really mind if it's MARCO-BOLO or not. We just need the thing to work and to be sustainable. That's I guess the second question.
Okay, so the second question is about what you call the derived product map. And for me, it's estimated variables. I come mostly from the biodiversity side, and the data we collect on the ground or in the water does not represent necessarily the variable we want to estimate. And there is a huge level of stat and sampling process to estimate the right variables. But then you get this variable, the abundance of some species, the distribution map of some habitat, etc. Where are those information, and how do you plan to manage that?
So again, in the overall data architecture that MARCO-BOLO connects with, if you have a derived product, there sometimes is a home for that. Like there's sometimes a national repository for this or an international repository for a derived product. Sometimes there isn't. And in that case, you can use generalist repositories like Zenodo or something of that kind to store the data, again, using some kind of standard, hopefully international standard, not your own standard, but an international one, so that it's interoperable. And then the metadata that describes it can be managed in exactly the same way we described everything else, right? To say that, look, I have this map of alpha diversity, Shannon alpha diversity of a certain species. It's hosted here. Here's the DOI. It's in this format. And importantly, that metadata can link the derived product to the raw product, right? I mean, to the raw data from which the product was estimated. That is often missing. And that's a real problem in biodiversity science, not just biodiversity science, but a lot of science. In order to get to the raw data, you have to email somebody. This is not going to work, right? The raw data itself has to be archived somewhere. MARCO-BOLO reuses a lot of data, so it points back to INSDC or others that host that data, and then links it on to the derived product. So if a MARCO-BOLO scientist downloaded a bunch of data to run a meta-analysis and generates a map, they archive the map, and their metadata trail says, I have a map here. It was based on those products, and I used this workflow to generate it. So you have the whole provenance trace, right? And again, all of that is in JSON-LD schema.org. Nothing special. It's just using web architecture well and completely.
And key to that is persistent identifiers and that ability to have it, as we've said, machine actionable. We can't rely on emailing, or colleagues anymore. This has to be something that can be automated because of this explosion of data that we're seeing.
Exactly. And so I think MARCO-BOLO is probably the only project that I know of that is registering its own permanent identifiers on the web using W3 IDs for its metadata artifacts, because the data usually already have a PID, like a DOI or something from GBIF, from OBIS, from INSDC. They usually already have that, but our metadata objects are just as important. And so we registered a W3 ID namespace for MARCO-BOLO, and that goes into our data management plan too. So the metadata itself is persistent digital objects on the web, which more or less aligns to the fair digital object aspiration. I'll drop an issue. I'll drop the right issue in the chat so that you can see what we're doing there and you can see the code. Anything else?
Okay, the last question was when you're having a monitoring scheme running, so collecting data for years and for hopefully forever. That's the purpose of monitoring. You don't want to include the description of the monitoring in each data set you release, as you can generate a endless number of data sets from the same monitoring scheme. But you still need metadata for each data set. So how do you manage, how do you envision this level of metadata? And just for the record, we are developing this issue in Biodiversity through the BioDash project.
Yeah, I mean, this is, Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just normal linked data practice, right? So if you have a description of, let's say, a project, a program, an organization, you create a metadata object for that. That's the full description. And again, connecting to Dan's point, if that has a permanent identifier on the web and it's serialized in JSON-LD, you just link, whenever you need to say that thing, you just link to it, right? So you don't have to repeat the whole text each time. You just point to the full description somewhere. That's especially important in case you need to update it. Because if you update it, you don't want to go out into the wild and find everywhere where you talked about that organization. You just update one file and then that's propagated through the linked data set. Of course, you should version control that so that any changes are logged and transparent, of course, so nobody gets a surprise. But that's normal linked open data architecture. You'll see that in a lot of our metadata archives. And it's also compliant with the OTIS specification and the IODE specification. There's no need to generate anything new. This is just how the web works. It's just that a lot of people have forgotten.
Thank you.
I think Isabel had a question.
Isabel?
Yeah, well, no, I think there's another question regarding the eDNA metabolically pipelines, maybe Onur,
I
Ogan.
think Christina pointed, Ona, to the work that's going on in MARCO-BOLO on the data analysis challenge, where they did exactly that. They compared pipelines, unless it was specific about the data challenges around it.
In terms of data management, I mean, the data challenge is great. That's where we do it. But of course, what we accept is that all of our scientists, they're innovators, right? So they want to use different methods and they want to use different workflows. But what we're asking them to do is to make sure that they create metadata objects that document those workflows and point to the full methodological description of what they did. That's sometimes different from what you publish in a paper. As we all know, journals like us to have a very short materials and methods section, and not everybody publishes their complete methods. So we're saying, no, please make sure you have the full trace, and we're going to make that also transparent. So again, when you have a derived product coming out of MARCO-BOLO, you can say, this product was generated by these methods that had those steps that are described by these documents, and use that raw data over there. And again, that linked data architecture points to each one of those assets as needed.
Okay, if there's no more question, I just wanted to say that we have now a number of opportunities of also creating let's say, a narrative that we should really try to convey. We have this living data conference, and we have also the World Biodiversity Congress next year. I mean, there have been many opportunities now, and I think it'll be very important to get a message that will be really conveyed in all these important meetings, really because sometimes, I mean, people still don't know that there is this architecture that is already existing, and that people can link with that and can really be helped really to bring their data to the world community, let's say.
Yeah, I think the living data one, particularly in October, is a really valuable example, because that obviously is combined. It isn't just the marine world, it's with GBIF, TADWIG and GEOBON broadly as well. So we can demonstrate then that this architecture, isn't a marine specific solution, that it does cross domains. I believe so. They've just closed the call for session suggestions on living data, and so the list of sessions should be coming out in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then they'll be open for abstracts.
Great. So if there's no more question, I think we can close the webinar now. So we just say thank you for everybody for joining. Thank you, Dan and Pierre, for presenting, and all of you for your questions. So the recording will be on the website soon. I will send an email to everybody that registered. And don't forget to save the date for the next webinar that is going to be in the 8th of May. And Obama Next is going to be the next project that's going to host the webinar. So we already have the speakers and the title of the webinar. I put on the chat, and I'm going to send some reminders again to everybody. And thank you so much for joining. So
Thank you,
hope you had a great time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for
Okay.
great questions.
Ciao.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.